Parshat VaYechi begins with the word VaYechi, which means "and he lived," and it refers to the life of Yaakov Avinu, and begins the wind down of Sefer Bereshit, where we hear about the end of Yaakov's life, the end of Yosef's life. What's interesting is that the word VaYechi, "and he lived," appears many times before that in the Torah. In fact, it first appears for Adam. VaYechi Adam shloshim u'me'at shana, and it lists things usually about the person when it appears, of how long they lived, the days of their years, so to speak. It's almost always the same formula, but not always identical. But a typical one, we go from Adam down to Shet, is VaYechi Shet Hamish Shanim u'me'at shana v'yoled et Enosh. VaYechi Shet Ahari Holido et Enosh Shev'a Shanim ושמונה מאות שנה ויולד בנים ובנות. ויחיו כל ימי שת 12 שנה ותשע מאות שנה וימות. That's the whole formula for Shet. So, and Seth lived 105 years and fathered Enosh. And Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and fathered sons and daughters, and all the days of Shet were 912 years, and he died. And then it goes on, VaYechi, and he lived, VaYechi Enosh, Tisheim Shana, Vayoled et Kenan. So, and Enosh lived 90 years, and he fathered Kenan. VaYechi Enosh, אחרי הולידו את קינן 15 שנה ו800 שנה ויולד בנים ובנות. And Enosh lived, after he fathered Kenan, 815 years and fathered sons and daughters. So the formula here in the sequence that begins with Adam is pretty regularly repeated, and it always finishes with ויחיו כל ימי אנוש so it ends with this other, and his days were this number of years when he dies. So it starts by talking about how long he lived, maybe until he has a child, and then it says again he lived another number of years after that, and then, towards his death. The point is that the word VaYechi appears in connection, in fact, for nearly everyone, going all the way from Adam down to Yosef, right? We have it for Adam, down through Noah, through Shem, for all the different descendants of Shem that lead us to Torah. And then we skip Abraham, and we skip Yitzchak. There's no VaYechi in connection with Abraham. There's no VaYechi, Yitzchak. And then we go for Yaakov, VaYechi Yaakov, and there's a VaYechi Yosef as well. And so that's the puzzle that's kind of interesting. Maybe it's not such a puzzle, but if we have something in the Torah that can be said about how the Torah wants to talk about the days in the life of every single generation from Adam HaRishon down through Shem, down through Noah, down through Shem, down through Terach, and into the Avot, but we skip over Abraham and Yitzchak, and then we get it for Yaakov and Yosef, we have to ask the question, what is the Torah trying to tell us by skipping over Abraham and Yitzchak? And of course, it's not the case that we never hear about Abraham dying, or we never hear about Yitzchak dying. They both die, they both are buried in Merat HaMachpelah. The Torah is explicit about that. It uses other words, Vayamat or Ve'guva, he expired, right? There are different ways of saying that someone died, and in fact, VaYechi means he lived, and so it's really starting the formula of telling about how they died. But in the case of Avraham and Yitzchak, we don't get that. There's no VaYechi. So what do Avraham and Yitzchak have in common with each other that they don't have in common with Yaakov, nor with Yosef, and maybe a little more weakly, but implicitly, they don't have in common with any of these other predecessors up through Terah, through the line of Shem, and up to Adam Rishon? And the answer, or at least I think the simple answer is Abraham and Yitzchak, unlike Yaakov, unlike Yosef, die and are buried in Eretz Yisrael. There is something about the fact that they end their lives in Eretz Yisrael that causes us to talk differently about what happened when they died. Because again, they did die, they were buried, but the Torah wants to use a different language for referring to it. And I think there are two other kinds of sources now that we can bring together. Well, I guess before jumping into that, I'll remark as well, we don't get a lot of information about where our Parshat or any number of other Yared, whatever, any number of other progenitors in the line of Shem or going up through Adam, where they lived and whether it was in Eretz Canaan or not. There are midrashim that suggest that Shem may have been found in Eretz Canaan at some point, but the Torah doesn't explicitly generate any connection between anyone before Avram with Eretz Yisrael, except insofar as Terach, his father, was on his way to Eretz Canaan when he died. So implicitly, we can say all these other people that come before Avram and Yitzchak, maybe they died in Eretz Yisrael, maybe they didn't, maybe they were buried there, maybe they weren't. But clearly the Torah doesn't see a significance in that because there was no sense that this was Eretz Yisrael yet. It was just the land like any other, full of different kinds of pagans. And really, it started to have that significance at the time of Avram. So the first time that it could matter where you were buried was for Avram, and he's buried in Eretz Yisrael, and he dies there, and it's something different. So with Yitzchak as well. And then when Yaakov and Yosef are outside of the land again, there's this association between them and sort of what comes before Avram, that they're back out in the world, right? They're back in the midst of the cultures and the civilizations that had flourished and would continue to flourish outside of Eretz Yisrael. And they're dying and they're being initially buried there. Obviously, eventually they're going to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Yaakov gets buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah, and Yosef Tzaddik gets buried in Shem. But that happens after they die. When they die, they are in fact both mummified and then they're in Egypt when they die. And so there's this sense that their life ends in a foreign context, in a context where the Oved Hashem is surrounded on all sides by people who don't have that same relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which, to be fair, was also kind of the case for Avraham and Yitzchak because they weren't yet a nation, and so they were in Eretz Canaan, but there were Canaanim there, and there was at some level also a mainstream society around them that had a different relationship to Hashem. But something about being in the land is seen by the Torah to alter that. Seeing the potential of the land, the future of the land, and the society that will be there. Dying in Eretz Yisrael somehow is different. And I think now there are two kinds of sources we can bring in that maybe just provide brief comments on how it's different. So one of them is the appearances of the word VaYechi in the context of the rest of Chumash. So in particular, the word appears in Sefer Devarim when Moshe is remarking in these kind of exhortative comments that he makes to Am Yisrael about what an amazing and marvelous thing it is that Am Yisrael have received the Torah. So he says, "Hashem'a am kol Elohim medaber b'toch ha'esh ka'asher sham'ata ata VaYechi." Did ever people hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire as you have heard and live? So that's from Perek Dalet in Sefer Devarim. There's another one in Perek Hey in Sefer Devarim. It's very similar. Ki mi chol basar asher sham'a kol Elohim hayim medaber mitoch ha'esh kamonu VaYechi. For who is there of all flesh who has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire as we have and lived? So interestingly there, Wayahi is not the beginning of talking about how someone's about to die. It's the opposite. It's that there's this expectation that something had happened where someone should have died and they didn't die. That relationship to Hakadosh Baruch Hu has a kind of a danger associated with it, and yet there is this miraculous either sustenance or uh, rejuvenation, or not rejuvenation, resurrection maybe is a better word, that can be associated with that. And the Midrashim pick up on this and they say, well, when Bnei Israel heard in the desert the voice of Hashem, and they heard the Ten Commandments, that the first two they listened to and they died. And so then Hashem had to bring them back to life. And then they said to Moshe, you go here, right? So there's this sense of being on the brink of death, but being miraculously sustained in this use of Wayahi in the context of Sefer Dvarim, talking about Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. And then when you go over to the rest of Tanakh, when you go over to Sefer Shoftim, for example, and it talks about Shimshon, he's there in Eretz Yisrael, and it's about how Kadosh Baruch Hu opens up this spring of water when he was dying of thirst, and he lived, right? So there's a miraculous provision of water in the land when Shimshon is nearly dying of thirst. Or when famously Eliyahu helps to bring a boy back to life who had seemingly died. וישמע אדוני בקול אליהו, ותשב נפש הילד על קרבו ויהי. So a child who had died comes back to life, right? And then we also get this with Elisha. There's an instance where his bones, after he had died, come into contact maybe with what seems to be the body of someone else who's being buried next to it. And he comes back to life. Wayahi. So we don't have to go through all the examples in Tanakh, and maybe in the case of Amatziyahu, it returns to the formula of Adam, which is interesting, and that has to be examined. But I think for that with Chizkiyahu, you also have his healing is Wayahi. So there's this definite sense of in Eretz Yisrael, or at the time of Matan Torah, Wayahi is about the opposition to death, the overcoming of death, the fact that relationship with Elohim Hayim makes it possible for there to be a miraculous triumph over death. And that's why all the rest of what we see in Tanakh, maybe with the exception of Matziyahu, and it's interesting to look at the case, but when we first encounter the term, it's always talking about someone's about to die, and we're just going to sum things up, count the years that they lived. And interestingly, we mentioned before that there's this return to Wayahi in the case of Yaakov, right? That he's going to die in Parshat Wayahi, and so Parshat Wayahi begins by summing things up for him in the way that it happened with previous generations. But actually, there's another moment that refers to this issue in Parshat Vayigash that has to do with when Yaakov goes down first to Mitzrayim. Because there's this very curious exchange when Yaakov Avinu meets Paro. And Paro says to him, this is the dialogue between Yisrael and Mitzrayim, represented by their leaders and their emblems in each case, right? What would they talk about, right? What would Yaakov talk about with Paro, who, ultimately so much of the rest of the Torah is going to be about getting free from Paro and turning from service of Paro to service of Hashem. So what are they going to talk about? Well, Paro says, so Vayomer Paro el Yaakov, Kama yemei shnei hayecha. And Paro says to Jacob, how old are you? Strange question to start with. Vayomer Yaakov el Paro, yemei shnei migurai shloshim u'me'at shana, me'at u'ra'im hayu yemei shnei hayai, ve'lo hesigo et yemei shnei hayei avotai, b'yemei megureihem. So Yaakov says to Paro, the days of my years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life have been and have not attained the days of the life and the years of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. Pilgrimage really maybe is not the right word here. It's more like they're dwelling or they're sojourning. But the point is, this is a repetition in some sense of a piece of the formula that we heard going back for Adam, Sheth, etc., where you don't just start with VaYechi, then you go on and say, and the days of their life, the Yemei Shnei, someone's life, were such and such. So Yaakov's answer is about the Yemei Shnei, his life, the days of the years of his life. And he refers to something that's kind of bad or inferior about his life in comparison with what? With Avotai, with his forefathers. And he means presumably Abraham and Yitzchak. And he refers even explicitly to Migurai or Migurehem, his sojournings and their sojournings, meaning where they dwell. So this is almost an explicit statement agreeing with what we have said so far about Abraham and Yitzchak, that they died in Eretz Yisrael because they were living in Eretz Yisrael when they died. And Yaakov is coming down to Mitzrayim and he knows he's going to die there. And he is sorrowful and expressing that to Paro in this moment where he's also referring in the formula of how he talks about the duration of his life back to Adam and Sheth and back to Noach and Shem and all of them. So this, I think, clinches it for us. There is this clear sense that there's a difference between dying in Eretz Yisrael and dying outside of Eretz Yisrael. And Yaakov's comment is that there's something me'at and ra about it, that there's something lessened about it, there's something worse about it, in a kind of, you could translate the ra as evil here, but that there's a sense of inferiority or a kind of a contraction to it that he refers to. And that in turn is being connected here with just the whole life and times of all of these proto-Ovdei Hashem, these potential servants of Hashem that came in previous generations, who were living, before the time of Abraham and before the possibility of being in Eretz Canaan, being in Eretz Yisrael. And then again, once we go past this, once we go past Yosef, we go through Yetziat Mitzrayim, and then there's the giving of the Torah. Suddenly, VaYechi is about miraculous life. And we go into Eretz Yisrael, and it's always about miraculous salvation and resurrection or deliverance and healing. And that, as a commentary as a whole, I think is just, at some level, saying that the Torah has a very simple statement to make to us, which is that life and death in Eretz Yisrael for Am Yisrael are different. They have to be viewed differently. And this is not to say at the same time that they're the only life that part of Am Yisrael can live. In fact, Yaakov, whose name is Yisrael, dies outside of Eretz Yisrael, right? And this is the second time he left. So all of the Avos have their differences. Avram came from outside of Eretz Yisrael, but died there. Yitzchak lived and died, never left in Eretz Yisrael. And Yaakov is born there, leaves, comes back, leaves again, and then dies. And so the example of Yaakov and much else that we have in Tanakh is telling us that part of being part of Am Yisrael, part of being Yehudim, is being able to make it outside of Eretz Yisrael and being able in our way to succeed and thrive and maintain relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And yet, Yaakov, while he does go down to Mitzrayim, knowing that Hashem is with him, HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises him that explicitly, he also, nonetheless, is showing us how that is to be viewed, right? What kind of life is there for one to live? What kind of existence is there for Israel, for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people to have outside of Eretz Yisrael. And the view from the standpoint of the Torah is that it's a life, but it's a life that, if we're going to talk about it in terms of VaYechi, and he lived, somehow that is more sunken down in the sense of the normal reality of death being the end of life. And while it's true that Avraham and Yitzchak do die, we're not saying they don't, there is something where the Torah is trying to suggest some sense of uplift, some sense of less gravity of that kind experienced by Avraham and Yitzchak. Because yes, they did die, but we don't hear VaYechi in the context of their dying. We hear in Eretz Yisrael VaYechi in the context of miraculous deliverance, of resurrection, of healing, of salvation. And again, I don't think that's telling us that therefore it's impossible to die in Eretz Yisrael. It might be telling us that it's preferable to. And on top of that, I think that, there's something deeper than that, because if you just limit it to being expressed as a preference, then it just kind of sounds like, okay, this is a better way of doing something. Check. I'll improve my performance in the following way, and it doesn't really get into the content of what is supposed to be better about it. But I think from all these different examples, part of what we get a sense of is that it's the land itself somehow, right? That, Avram and Yitzchak were not yet part of nations, and they were still just in this place. But there's a sense of different relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's possible in the land itself. And as a consequence, a difference to the meaning of life and a difference to the meaning of death. And perhaps that, has to do with what one is able to feel one is a part of when living on the ground that one's going to be buried in, and knowing that this is the ultimate place to which the eyes and hearts and souls of all of Am Yisrael are meant to orient themselves. And I think commenting in practical terms, and even in modern times, when you don't feel always exactly like Shimshon with or Eliyahu, with obvious revealed miracles happening in the way we read about in Tanakh, there is still a sense that it's a different world, right? That the perspective one has on what happens here and what it means for Am Yisrael is different when lived from within, from the inside. And when this is a moment in the modern history of the state of Israel when that's very palpably felt, that the eyes of the world are on what's happening here right now because of the war that we've been fighting. And the kinds of conversations that people have and considerations that they weigh. And I'm talking not only about people in general in the world, but even Jews who discuss this when it's happening outside of the land. It's impossible to avoid the way it's thought about being different, because the framing of what's going on in the whole global conversation is different, because it's heavily influenced by the perspective of the very numerous people who are outside of this place and who don't know what's going on here and don't experience it and don't see it. And so, as a result, all sorts of conversations can be had about, oh, well, maybe people should do this, maybe people should do that. And it's obviously just a completely different discussion when, practically speaking, the things that are happening in earshot of where you're living, whether it's rockets or artillery strikes or whatever else, where and a whole lot more obviously going on that people are deeply connected to and intertwined with, and there's no getting distance from it. And as a result, the whole framework with which you evaluate the choice of what to do and the meaning that life can have while it's happening here is bound up in the collective future of Am Yisrael in a way that is much less optional and much more rooted in the land itself in a way that it seems inseparable from the land. So, no, that last comment is maybe not 100% obvious from the text itself, and I think there may be many other aspects that we could try to look at in thinking about what is the Torah trying to tell us when it sees a difference between what it means for a Jew to die outside of the land, for a Jew to die inside the land. But it is certainly the case that that difference is delineated in these passages in a way that we should weigh and consider, because now that there is an opportunity for Am Yisrael to live here and to live full lives here and to end life here, that is not an opportunity to be missed lightly. And Yaakov Avinu may have felt he had no choice, that indeed HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him that he was with him and he should go down to Mitzrayim. But even knowing that Hashem was with him, he couldn't help but view the path that he was on with a dourness and a sorrow that he expresses to Paro. And ultimately, it's very appropriate that he expresses it to Paro, because when seeking to end one's life outside of Eretz Yisrael, that there is a due that's paid to Paro in the participation in his society, so to speak, that is hard to avoid. And perhaps it's the freedom from that due that gives that liberation from the gravity of the VaYechi outside of the land that Avraham and Yitzchak seem to experience, where we have this reorientation towards the miraculous uplift and the resurrection and return to life that can be possible